Hey everyone, and welcome back to Professor's Play. Season 2 of Professor's Play. We're ready. We're back. Yeah. We're back, baby. 100 years Professor's Play. The show where you can get just a pixel of deep thinking with your mostly nonsensical video game discussions. I am Professor Phil Chavot. He's Professor John Adams. He's Professor Brendan West. And together we are professors who play video games. And I wrote down here, we are back, baby, so I wanted to say that again. Back from our summer hiatus, so we are professors, so we still teach in the summer, but, you know, stuff happened. We weren't all here. Brandon did not. I didn't either, actually. So we're back from our hiatus, back to our hubris about video games.
Yeah.
To start off, we decided to tackle a simple, definitely not giant or complex game. We'll be talking about, I think it's called Baldur's Fence.
Baldur's Gate? What
yes.
is that game?
No,
that
I think
one.
it's the third one, right?
Yeah. Baldur's Gate 3, which we have not played before, I think.
Nope, definitely not. In any sort of capacity.
Before we get into that, I'm going to ask my co-hosts and co-podcast people how they're doing. John, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, yeah. Haven't touched Baldur's Gate. Kidding. I got really obsessed with it. As soon as it came out, I just thought I would download a test version of it. Tried to make sure it would run on my PC, and I cheated, guys. I'm like 30 hours into this game.
You told me you were 30 hours in like 4 days ago, so I don't believe you're 30
I don't know what my time is at, but luckily Steam has that data publicly available,
yes,
so one of
true.
you guys can check out and say.
You're like, damn it, John.
He is currently at, yeah.
Yeah, he's beat the game, actually.
I have not beat the game.
Okay.
I'm still in the process. So
That's good to hear. You're basically at the point we're going to be in 3 weeks.
yeah, I think so. I
Okay.
think right at that point.
Great.
Yeah.
Brandon, how are you?
I'm doing well. I just got confirmation today that I did get my degree, so I am officially graduated.
Can we call you Doctor now?
I am officially Dr.
Wow.
West, yes.
Dr. West.
Well
Thank you.
done.
Well done,
Thank
sir.
you.
I know.
Well done.
Whew, load
That's
up.
it. That's all years of studying were for that exact moment.
11 years.
Yeah.
From us specifically.
From us, oh yeah.
Yeah. Other people, whatever.
I will say, I have also started playing Baldur's Gate. I am not 30 hours in. I'm probably closer to maybe 10, because I'm playing with a friend. He and I are, so we're doing like
Co-op in it.
just
Are you
the
doing
two
like
of us.
it's a D&D session basically?
Pretty much.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, so it should.
We'll get into that.
But that does mean that I only play when he's available.
I see.
That's D&D.
So
Yes.
yeah, so that's definitely slowing it down, which is why I'm not anywhere near as deep.
But that's good because you know we're going to be moving at different paces. I am also good. Thanks for asking. But I have created my character, which took like an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, and then I walked into the first room and I was like, time to go to bed. And I went to sleep, and I haven't touched it in a few days. But that's because at that point I was like, I'm going to pick this up once we do the episodes. I want to go in like 100% fresh after talking to you guys.
That'd be nice.
So before we get into actually talking about the game itself and some other stuff around the game and that sort of culture, we're going to there's a few housekeeping or I guess office keeping items that I wanted to address. So we are moving from bi-weekly to a tri-weekly show. Is tri-weekly a word?
Tri-weekly is a word.
Tri-weekly? Great. So instead of every 2 weeks, we're doing every 3 weeks. The reason for that is there's a few reasons, but mainly we just felt a little rushed whenever we had to play these large games, and this gives us more of some more window to play some larger games and do some specific episodes that we'd like.
It'll let us play more of the AAA games, because frequently those are the ones that we kind of bulk at doing in a 2-week period.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll have some. So each episode will be 3 weeks apart. Right? So in 3 weeks we're going to do a first impression episode for Baldur's Gate, and then 3 weeks after that, so in 6 weeks we'll be finishing it, which should be good because this game I think is about like 60 hours, 50 or 60 hours long. That's if you just like.
That's if you're like
blazing through it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It has. We're going to talk about this, but it has over 170 hours of cutscenes, which you won't see in one playthrough, but still.
Not with that attitude.
We have, as you can see, you're right, actually. You can save
You
scum,
can save
make a different
scum.
decision,
Yeah.
keep playing.
Exactly.
As you can see, we have a new microphone, new sound setup. We are trying some different things to make us sound better. Not that we sound great, but to make the sound get to you better.
We are listening to you.
Yes.
In the YouTube comments.
We are.
When you say we can't hear you.
We're
to
trying.
fix that.
We're trying
On a professor's budget.
Yes, which is not a lot.
That's how you know the show's authentic.
True. So eventually we'll have a microphone for each of us, and our own little separate sound editing systems. But right now,
Maybe a studio.
we have a better microphone.
Maybe
Maybe a studio. Possibly you. Shenanigans. We'll also be trying to make this episode a little shorter. I know it doesn't sound like it right now, but we feel like we often get excited and go a little too long, which is awesome. But, podcasting, media, that kind of stuff, it's better to be less long-winded, so we're going to try to keep this to around an hour if we can. Other than that, everything is the same. The same professors play that you know and love. Definitely love.
Still playing video games.
Still playing video games. Still being professors.
Yep.
Yeah.
So like I said, let's get into our first series for this season. Season 2, Series 1, Baldur's Gate 3.
Baldur's Gate 3.
That was a nice little segue there. You see that?
I liked it.
I should be doing this professionally.
Yeah, but you should edit this part out.
I should just like green screen right here in front of Brendan. Yeah. It's a ghost. Oh. So what is Baldur's Gate 3 for you, dear listener? I also had to look this up. It is produced by Larian Studios, which does often do like medieval RPGs, right? Mm-hmm. They didn't make the first 2 Baldur's Gates, but did this one. It's a turn-based high fantasy computer RPG. Remember when we had a little discussion on video game genres?
Yep.
Because if I just say it's an RPG, it could be a lot of things, right? So turn-based high fantasy computer RPG. However, really that is bearing the lead here because it's a video game RPG, a computer RPG as far as CRPG, based on probably the most famous tabletop RPG in existence, Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, and I think for those of you that have not played Dungeons & Dragons or don't have a lot of experience with Dungeons & Dragons, we want to take a moment here to talk about what is Dungeons & Dragons.
Yes.
It's essentially a board game or a game that would happen in what they would call the theater of the mind or your imagination, and it's a form of collective storytelling where everybody at the table is telling this story by either being the characters or you have one person who is the GM that is in charge of being all of the environment and the enemies, the game master or dungeon master in Dungeons & Dragons proper. And the job between the characters and this dungeon master is to tell a story, and then when we have points where we're not sure how the story might go next, you roll a series of dice. Very famously in Dungeons & Dragons, a 20-sided dice, and that 20-sided dice determines what happens. So if my character is talking to a merchant and I say, I would like this good for cheaper, and the merchant says, no, I have to sell it for what it's worth, and we get into a bartering situation, instead of relying on our actual bartering capabilities, which as nerds might not be in the realm of where it should be, we just roll dice and the dice determine the outcome. And that is true for all of your attacks, your fighting, your spells, because you don't want people actually fighting each other across the table.
Yeah, so I think that's key, because oftentimes we'll think of maybe a lot of people know about the D20 thing and like rolling a dice to do things.
Right.
But in Dungeons & Dragons, the thing is you roll a dice because you have conversations, right, depending on what you're trying to do. So it's not just like you can see in RPGs or you play Persona, for example, you roll a dice every time you attack to see if you hit or not, how much damage you do. In Dungeons & Dragons, you roll a dice every time you talk to someone, basically.
Right, anytime you do anything that would be controversial. So there's a good rule in DM, when you're being a DM, when you're being a Dungeon Master, that you want to do as few rolls as possible. But the rolls should occur every time that the character might do something or might not do something. A choice is sort of being made. Now, one of the really interesting things about D&D because of this is D&D is what, and I've presented at conferences on this for Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, we're nerds, we get it.
Yeah, talking about what makes D&D unique as a game or tabletop RPGs is that they are a post-structural...
Oh, good.
They're a post-structural...
Pixel of depth.
Pixel of depth coming here. They're a post-structural construction of a story, a post-structural story, meaning that if you asked at the beginning of a D&D game, how is the story going to go? Nobody could tell you, right? Because it's not up to the GM, it's not up to the players, it sort of occurs between them. Nothing has constructed this story. This story gets constructed in the spaces between constructions, right? Between people, right? And so it's interesting that way because it doesn't rely on one person's vision, because if you just have one person writing a D&D game, that's a story.
Yeah.
And what's most interesting about this today, because I won't belabor it and go deep into post-structuralism for all of our sakes, is that this is an element that makes D&D feel unique and original and cool and fun to play, and it's an element that gets removed when you take it to a CRPG.
Yes.
Because while the computer can anticipate a lot of your actions, it can't possibly fathom everything you have to do, and every action that you might be able to take needs to be pre-programmed. And so one of the really cool things...
the computer could. The programming is the hard part.
The programmer would have to account for that ahead of time, which is impossible, just like it's impossible for a DM to do that sort of thing.
Oh, yeah.
And so you have the really interesting situation where the programmer has to create a game that is broad enough and has enough choices that it feels like you could do anything at any moment and make the choices you want to make. And that's what makes this an incredibly difficult game to make. And I'll say in advance, spoiler, I think Larian pulled it off.
Yeah.
And it's why this feels like such an achievement, is that it feels like you have an incredible amount of freedom.
Yeah.
I think they did a good job, but I will say, I'm not as far into the game, and maybe my opinion will change. But at this point, I don't quite feel like they pulled it off, because I remember there's this one part in the game, and I'll try not to give any spoilers, where you're standing on one side of a cave, there are people on another side, but between you is a guardian statue that'll shoot you dead if you try to cross it at the level where you get there. And I thought, in the game, we can't communicate with these people. In D&D, you could definitely communicate with those people because you could just shout across.
Say, hey.
Exactly.
Statue.
So the game really doesn't, and I'm not even sure if it's possible to do so, but it doesn't really account for all the options that you have in D&D.
I'll give that to you. It's not perfect, but I would say that I would expect
relax.
a game to get to 40 or 50% of that, and I'd say this game gets to 60 or 70% of that most of the time.
I think that's fair. I mean, you have to remember, D&D is a game where if there's a cave full of spiders and you want something out of that cave, it is technically possible to hire 50 people, buy them all pickaxes, and have them tunnel underneath the cave to get whatever you want.
Mm-hmm.
The game does not account for that.
Unlimited options exist, yeah.
Yeah.
So, in theory.
What I've seen is, I think, is kind of in line with the last point of when you agreed here, that it's people saying that it's the closest thing to D&D as a video game
that we've ever got.
So essentially they're
That might be fair.
if someone was like, you know what if we put D&D in a game, and they were like, that's dumb, video games are already video games. They're like, no, I mean legitimately D&D with all the freedom possible, all the rolls, all that stuff, because you can literally roll a dice on screen to do stuff. Right. You roll dice.
So the game D&D comes with, it is a game played with textbooks, right? You have a set of 2 to 3 to 20 textbooks. You read them and use those to determine your stats, which you write down on a note sheet, and that note sheet helps you determine the math that gets added to your dice rolls.
Yes.
And this game recreates that.
So the interesting thing here is that essentially this is a novel for games in the sense that every single game, for everything you do in the game, there's math in the background happening. Yep. So the fact that you can walk as Mario in Mario Sunshine is because the math in the background is saying that you can walk. Right? There's no possibility of you not being able to walk until you hit a wall. There's no the wall's going to be you can't. The math says this is a collision thing. You can't go past this wall unless you have something that lets you go through walls, or you can jump over it. Right. So everything is math, and the same thing for attacks. So when you are playing, even in a live combat game, so you're playing
Call of Duty.
Yeah, Call of Duty or a God of War. When you swing your axe, there's math happening to make sure that if you're at the right distance, it's going to hit it, how much damage it's going to do, are they blocking? So that math is always happening. In this game, we just see it happening as a dice being rolled actually on screen.
On the surface. And you can actually know your numbers so that you can optimize them.
Yes.
Which is something that is done in the game of D&D and has been brought.
Yeah, so the min-maxing, right? So trying to maximize your character based on what they're good at. So for example, if my character's stat for strength is 17, and the max is 20, if I need to beat someone, and to beat that person, I have to roll something really high, I have a good possibility of doing that because my strength is really high.
Exactly.
Other way around, also true. So if to kill someone, I have to roll really high, but my strength is 5, I probably won't get that.
You're statistically less likely.
Yes.
And it is nice that in regular
it can still happen.
In regular D&D, you have to do those stats kind of in your head.
Yep.
This luckily does do some of it for you, where it'll say you have a 65% chance.
Which is like Fire Emblem.
Yeah.
Fire Emblem is
it feels
essentially
very
this.
Fire Emblem.
Fire Emblem is whenever you go attack something, they tell you you have a 65% chance of beating this thing, which most of the time you will. Sometimes it won't. So do you want to risk going into it and losing a unit forever?
We should play Fire Emblem. Brandon would love it.
Brandon would love Fire Emblem.
Be about it.
But yeah, so that was some how Baldur's Gate is D&D. So good for you D&D fans. You got a movie with Chris Pine. Now you got a game in of it. Now you got a CRPG that is the closest thing to D&D that we'll get for a while. I want to say
Probably.
because from what I understand, it doesn't account for hiring 50 people to dig under the spiders, but it accounts for 50 possibilities instead of
so much.
Whereas games, not that games don't give you freedom like Breath of the Wild and stuff like that, but there are limitations to what you can do. In this game, there are limitations, but they are less.
Pretty extensive.
It's pretty extensive. Mm-hmm. So, as you can see, we have some connections to D&D, personal experience-wise. I have 0 connections to D&D. I've never played it. I know what it is. I've seen episodes of people playing it online.
We've got to play
stuff
game.
like that. Perhaps. I played FIFA, which was, we talked about this. I played a lot of FIFA.
That's not D&D.
You're right. It's essentially like, I was thinking about how FIFA is D&D because every time you shoot, they're rolling a dice to be like shot power, shot accuracy, your body position, and the goalie's ability to save it.
Uh-huh.
So they're rolling a dice for all those things, and that's why it goes in or not when you're playing the game.
This sounds like a real non sequitur to me.
You're a non sequitur.
Your face is a non sequitur.
So John said here, at the risk of sounding like a hipster, I've been playing D&D long before it was cool. I said, I don't think it's like cool, but I think it's definitely cooler.
It's definitely cool now. You've got
Sure.
TV shows, you've got posters, you've got videos, movies.
He's struggling
Yeah.
already.
It's great. It's the world's greatest game. No, I've been playing D&D since probably about 6th grade. Picked up the original 3rd edition kit and really haven't put it down since. I just finished a game that went all the way to level 20 that lasted 7 years that I had to bring to a conclusion. But I usually play the GM. I don't actually get the chance to play as a character very often, so it's really fun in this game to be like the character.
Nice. So John has played a lot of D&D. Brandon, how did you get to play D&D?
So I've been playing D&D for for pretty much as long as I've known this guy, for almost 10 years
This guy.
now.
He pointed at John, to be clear.
Yeah, I started playing my last year of college, but I only played, that game went for 2 sessions. Honestly, I wasn't really into it, but that wasn't anyone's fault, it just hadn't clicked for me yet. Then when I got to grad school and I met him, he put together a D&D campaign. That's when I started playing. And
Famous last words right there. Yeah,
I like to grow people.
when I met John.
Playing with new players is one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah, though I will say I'm probably his least favorite player at this point, because I was in that level 20 campaign, and let's just say my character did some pretty wacky stuff.
Does he do that stuff that he does when he played Magic, where he's just like...
Brandon is a min-maxer.
Oh, yeah.
Textbook min-maxer.
Oh, yeah.
Brandon is like...
That's what he does with
I'm
Magic. He
going to
gets
make
all
sure
the lands out.
I can do
Like-
16 shots per round.
Yeah, he gets 30 lands out, so that every time he does anything, he's doing damage, and it takes 2 hours for his turn to happen.
Yeah, I think my character did over 500 damage to the Dragon Goddess in our last session of that campaign. It was awesome. I will probably never top that moment as a player. I do DM as well. I actually prefer DMing, though I like playing. So this is pretty cool to continue, especially given the recent end of the level 20 campaign.
Yeah, it'll be pretty neat. We will try not to talk about our D&D campaign, because talking about your D&D campaign is a little bit like describing a dream. The other person just nods nicely, but nobody else is
It's
as
me right
as
now.
you
I'm
are.
nodding.
Yeah.
Not so
promise
maybe not so
listeners.
nicely. But the thing that I think is interesting, which we don't have to get into maybe later, but the relationship between DM and players. And we can talk about how the relationship between you and the game itself could
Or
be similar.
Larian as a... Yeah.
Could be similar.
Yeah.
So we'll get into that potential future Pixel of Death, future site.
That'd be cool.
Nice. So as a background here for Baldur's Gate, as you notice, it's called, well, maybe you haven't, but I will tell you right now, it's called Baldur's Gate 3. So there are other Baldur's...
It's the second Baldur's Gate, yeah.
Baldur's Gate? Baldur's Gates?
Baldur's Gates.
Baldur's Gates?
Yeah.
Gates of Baldur.
I can't know this guy.
No, because it's the name of the city. It'd be like saying there are other phoenixes.
I'm well aware, but you can see the road of Phoenix.
Okay, this is a weird sidetrack. We're not getting to this. So actually, this game has so there's a direct prequel to this, which is Baldur's Gate 2, that came out in 2000. So 23 years ago was the direct prequel, although there are a lot of other games set in the same universe, right? It is actually set 120 years in world after Baldur's Gate 2.
Yep.
And Baldur's
it
Gate
is
1
considered canon for the D&D
Yes.
universe as well.
Yes.
Because
It's based on the 5th edition. It's continued. Everything in here is canon for several different things, which also means that there are realms connecting between Baldur's Gate and D&D. Yes, Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff.
Marvel Cinematic Universe stuff.
So this game has been in development for the better part of a decade, and it's been in beta for about 3 years. So what that means is that they have been working on it for 6 or 7 years, I think. 6. And it has been open to certain people that got into it, bought access or stuff like that, for 3 years, ironing bugs and all that kind of stuff. So it just came out, but if you feel like you've heard about this before, it's because it's been kind of out for 3 years, right? The thing to note is that this is a third installment of the much larger series, right? So there are other titles besides Baldur's Gate 1 and 2. And there's a tremendous amount of world building because it's not only Baldur's Gate world building, but also combined with D&D world building, also combined with some Larian world building, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of lore in here that has been mishmashed into a lot more lore.
Right.
So much lore.
So much lore.
So much lore.
They're literal books. You can just sit down and read books.
Yes, you can just sit. If you think playing a game is boring, sit down and read a book.
In a game.
And so there's monsters from different parts of different types of things, from Baldur's Gate, from D&D, from Larian, etc. So the thing also here, Baldur's Gate's story is kind of like John was talking about. It's not post-structural in the sense that like obviously someone made the story and you can play it, so it's not the same as a D&D campaign.
Right.
But there are a lot of branching narratives in there. Like there's different ends for different characters that can happen independently or mutually with each other. Right? Like I said, there's over 170 hours of cutscenes, but when I meant that you don't see them in a single playthrough is because you make a decision, you don't get to see the cutscene associated with the other decision. Right? So you can create your own character. You can use a template character. Right? Is that what it's called?
Or like it's kind of interesting because you can play with the other characters that are part of the story.
Yes.
So like, I'm trying to think of a game that would.
The overarching story.
The overarching story. This would be like if, like, when you start Skyrim, you could choose to play as your own guy, or you could choose to play as, like, the Jarl of High Hrothgar, right? Like, you could just be in Skyrim as that person, or you could play as one of the other main story characters.
Because it is a role-playing game, right? So you're either role-playing as yourself for a character you create to represent yourself for some other role, right? For example, I'm playing as the main character of my favorite anime isekai or, like, RPG type thing. He's hilarious, so that's gonna be funny. But John, I know, is playing as himself because he always does that.
RPGs. First
game, he always plays as himself. So you can do that, or you can pick one that already exists, right? Because like I said, it took me like 2 hours to make a character because there's a lot of choice. Mm-hmm. Playtime for the main campaign is about 50 hours if you're like doing just main campaign stuff.
Yeah.
But it's probably gonna be like 80 or 90 if you're like having fun with it.
I think so. And also if you're not good, because a lot of the fights I have to try a few times.
Yeah, I'm
They
playing.
definitely make fights way harder than you would in an actual D&D campaign.
Yeah, I'm in the least difficulty.
I'm on the highest.
I'm on normal.
I heard tactician.
I thought you went on the highest.
No, I'm on normal.
That's why we went on the highest.
Well, no, I heard tactician is like actually very, very difficult.
It's brutal.
It's pretty hard. Yeah, like we get tapped out quite a bit, and I sit there thinking like, yeah, I thought I kind of knew D&D well, and then I was like pretty good at it. Like I want to port Isabella like into this game.
Right.
I do work.
I feel like
you can do Gloomstalker.
I could, yeah. Well, I'm playing a sorcerer.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that, like, you remember when we were talking about Persona 4 Golden? Remember all those years ago, fans, viewers. We talked about Persona 4 Golden, how they had like different sliders for different difficulty things, and I think this game could have used.
This game could have used that badly.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, that would have been nice.
So let's talk about some D&D influence here. So we already did John's post-structural pixel depth, but also I put here like what's BG's pulling from D&D, which is from the 5th edition. But Brandon, you mentioned here some mechanics from Larian's other games, and I would like to know like what.
Yeah. So the friend that I'm playing Baldur's Gate 3 with, I also played Divinity Original Sin 2 with.
Which is Larian's other biggest game.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of this game really just feels like Divinity to me. So, for example, in Divinity, anytime you use like an ice spell, it will create a layer of ice under people. They ported that over into Baldur's Gate. That is not a thing in D&D 5e.
Oh, interesting.
Except for with Hailstorm.
Yeah, it has to be like only specific spells do that. Not every ice type spell.
Does Ray of Frost do that?
Effects. Not Ray of Frost, but Ice Knife does.
Oh, interesting.
Which it doesn't in Dungeons and Dragons, and so the thing that keeps tripping me up in this game is when the mechanics stop being a mirror of 5e and become like a mishmash of 5e plus Divinity, because I don't anticipate that, and so sometimes spells will have secondary effects that they just don't have in D&D that they would have had if they were in like Divinity. Like an electric spell will also give you like the shocked condition, which doesn't exist in 5e. And so stuff like that is still tripping me up pretty bad.
Yeah,
right
but I think that's also kind of Larian being like, this is D&D, but we have to put our spin on here because or else they would ask like, why didn't this Wizards of the Coast make a game?
Because Wizards of the Coast aren't video game developers.
Right, but like, why didn't they contract someone to do this? Is what I'm saying.
Didn't they contract Larian?
I don't think it was like I think it was more of a relationship.
Honest, I don't actually. I will say this. This is currently my biggest criticism of the game is I hate the mismatch of elements because if I wanted every spell to have that secondary effect, I would go replay Original Sin 2, which is a good game to be clear. But I kind of went into this game from what John had said, expecting like just a complete port of 5e, which it is not. And I know the 5e system relatively well because I've been playing it for almost 10 years and DMing it, and I've read like the monster manual all the way through, so I know most of the monsters' stats. So any change from that like really trips me up and throws me off. It's not what I expected.
So I'm gonna get into that a little bit here, but I want to ask also like why this is for both of you. Why did they pick the 5th edition? I don't really understand how these things work, so maybe that's a dumb question.
So 5th edition is a very popular edition. So to give you a weird little bit of D&D history, D&D 3.5 was really popular and a good amount of people played it.
When did these come out?
3.5 came out in 2000s sometime in there. Yeah, 2000 sometime in there, and it was pretty popular and lots of people played it, but a lot of people wanted more tactical style combat, and Warhammer, the other game, was sort of taking off, which was a very, very tactical board game style game. And so D&D moved to the 4th edition and made a very board-based tactical grid pattern, and it was such a change to the way people felt about D&D, because a lot of people are into D&D for this storytelling aspect, that it bombed really hard. People hated it, they didn't think it felt like a new edition, and it created such a division that a company took all of the 3.5 information and made a new game that is almost identical to 3.5, and that's where we now get Pathfinder, if you've heard people talk about it. Pathfinder is people that wanted to keep playing 3.5 when 4th edition came out. So Wizards of the Coast took that feedback, stepped back, and went, okay, we're going to do a new edition 5e, we're going back to that storytelling style, and we're going to simplify it, because 3.5 was really crunchy. It had a lot of math and numbers involved in it. And that new simplified 5th edition was kind of the perfect balance for a lot of people.
When did that come out?
It came out in 2012.
Mid-2010s, okay.
Yeah, mid-2010s.
Okay.
And it was sort of the perfect balance, and it took off. It became incredibly popular. It sold more than any other edition of D&D. And then that combined with like Stranger Things, Critical Role, Big Bang Theory, all happening at once, made 5e kind of like the D&D edition, short of like second E if you're from the 80s and you're a purist, which Brandon would be probably if he started playing in the 80s.
Probably. I actually do have a second edition manual. One of my players gave it to me. He actually did play back in the 80s.
But that's why 5e. They're currently working on a new edition, but people really love 5e.
So they release new editions like every decade or so?
Yeah. Because you have to release a bunch of books over the course of a decade.
Okay.
But
cool.
Good question.
So what I wanted to talk about with Brandon's point here about it not being a 100% one-to-one port of D&D into video game is the idea of transmediation. Right? So transmediation, we talked about this a little bit before, but it's the adaptations of narrative universes from one medium to another. Right? It's basic description there. This is a definition from Jamie Banks, who's a CMC or computer-mediated communication scholar, and she has a paper called "Gratification Sought from Video Games to Film," with films, right? So Assassin's Creed, what's the one that's Warcraft, Prince of Persia, stuff like that.
Yep.
But this was in the mid 2010s.
So video games to film.
Yes, and this is. Before I get into that, not to be confused, transmediation not to be confused with paratexts, which are like external texts that support a central text. So in the sense, the difference between a transmediation in this case, which is Baldur's Gate going from tabletop, or D&D going from tabletop into Baldur's Gate, right? That's a transmedia thing. A paratext would be if Baldur's Gate had a book about it, which it might, that helps you play the game. Right? This is a different discussion we can have, but I think this is the first video game that the transmedia property is a tabletop RPG. That is not like, I'm going to make a D&D game and call it D&D, right? Because we have Warhammer video games, right? Which comes as a tabletop RPG. So I struggle to think about this, and I just, when Brendan's talking about the idea that it is not a one-to-one port, it's interesting in the discussion of like, well, is it transmediation or is it then a paratext situation?
Yeah. Where does that line? Because it's real fuzzy. And
it's
gray.
a real fuzzy line. It's a real fuzzy line. It's not always fuzzy, but it is in this sense, right? Because we're like, it is not called D&D the video game. It's called Baldur's Gate, inspired by 5th edition of D&D, and it's not a one-to-one port as he described. So, trying to use D&D logic to Baldur's Gate doesn't work all the time.
Right.
Yeah.
Which, for you, is a bad thing, so to speak, right? It's not ideal because you're trying to like, okay, if I do this decision, I'm going to win this battle because in D&D I would, whereas Baldur's Gate, maybe it doesn't work that way.
Exactly.
For me, that is not bad because I don't know the D&D logic. So I'm like, Baldur's Gate logic is this. So when I then try to go into D&D, I might try to apply some of this logic into that. So that's why sometimes I think I've been going back and forth on this because it could be a paratext in the sense that, for me, Baldur's Gate is the central text of D&D.
Right.
Because then I'll go to play D&D next. And in my eye, I'm going to use the Baldur's Gate logic and knowledge into D&D. For you guys, D&D is the central text. Baldur's Gate is the paratext.
Yeah, and I will say that I'm not as upset about it as Brandon is. I'm not quite as much of a purist about the nature of Baldur's Gate, because there are games that are direct one-to-one ports, right? We have like Risk Online, we have like Monopoly Online that are just, you will actually roll dice against a fake board and move fake chips in just a digital setting, right? And I think that those games suck, right? Like, they're not good.
Well, they're just the game.
Just the game there.
Just the game
like,
put
especially
online,
if I have to play with other live people, at that point I'd rather go and play a game of Monopoly.
Yeah.
So I want a little bit of that transmediation. Maybe not quite to the extent where we have like spell abilities changing.
Right.
But I want a little bit of the transmediation in that I want it to get rid of all of the things about D&D that are difficult in person.
Well, to be clear, the transmediation is supposed to be as close to one-to-one as possible.
Right. And I think it should be, but I think it's allowed to ascend that medium in the same way that, like, if you take a book and you transmediated it into a movie, right? I wouldn't want that movie to be a list of text on a screen scrolling. I would want to be able to see the characters, see the costuming, see the music. For me, some of those transmediation changes here are those. They're like quality of life changes that only a video game affords, and a big one is like the ability to play or not play with other people. Because the worst part of D&D, for anybody that's ever played D&D, is that you have to get 4 adults to commit 4 hours of their life a week to play this game on a coordinated schedule, and it's impossible.
Yes, and the game I'm DMing right now, we're across multiple time zones, and it has been like a real pain because my TG schedule just changed, so we're currently working on that.
And so being able to play like alone, and then being able to have a party of people that feel like real characters, even if they're not real characters, is, I would still say, transmediate.
Well, they're real characters, not real people playing.
They're not real people playing those characters. Is a feeling of transmediation, but I think it is still transmediation. I think to be a paratext, there would have to be unification in the story somehow, not a brand new story. And
I see what you're saying. It's just that there are different levels of paratextual support. Right. So if at any point I find myself playing D&D and I use information from Baldur's Gate, then it gets into a real fuzzy area of one is a paratext of the other. Right. So I kind of come from this view of a paratext is in the eye of the beholder, but at the same time we have a definition. So like, the example I like to use is you can buy, at the time of Star Wars Force Awakens came out, there was you could buy a bag of like Mandarin Origins that had BB-8 on it. Right, because BB-8 is a little droid that's circular and is white and orange. If that bag of oranges helps you remember who BB-8 is, that's a paratext. Right? But it's not the same level of support as buying the official art book for Force Awakens. Right? So I don't want to get too muddled here, but it is a transmediation thing, but it's just funny how like sometimes those lines are really blurred between transmediate and
there is
paratext.
A line, but it's pretty gray and blurred.
It can be, So I asked, like, is this an example of extreme transmediation where we go from a tabletop game to a video game, right? But I think John, you put it as an outlier because it was given such care and attention. Was that you? Or yeah. I agree with it, but I disagree in the sense that I think I don't think this. I know we live in a transmediated society. Like everything is always being ported to different media. I think we'll see more stuff like this, but I will say that it is, in terms of care, it is potentially an outlier. Because as we know, the Warcraft movie, not very good. The D&D movie, though, good.
The Aragon video game. Oh man, that was a bad movie turned into a bad video game, and it was shockingly.
The Indiana Jones video game, one of the worst games ever. Same
Really?
with the ET video game.
Oh,
So
the
bad.
ET.
Yeah, so those are all the examples of transmediation, right?
Okay.
Where like the game itself isn't one-to-one what's on screen, but it is attempting to take what's on screen and put it in the game. So that's transmediation. But then you can argue that it also acts as a paratext in the sense that like if I never watched ET and played the game, then I would never want to watch ET.
Right.
Because it colored my opinion about that thing.
And I mean, I said it earlier, so not to berate the point, but I think the interesting thing about Baldur's Gate is that we're transmediating a text that doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We're transmediating a text that gets co-created between people. So we're almost transmediating a feeling or an impression, a second-hand ghost, a fragment of what we want to transmediate.
It's like ephemeral.
It's
right?
ephemeral,
Yeah.
right? We're transmuting something ephemeral into something that needs to feel ephemeral while being...
Not be, because we talk
Not
about
being ephemeral.
like everything we talk about is in Portal, right? Everything in the game is there for a reason.
Pre-planned.
Unless it's a bug they missed, like everything in there is there for a reason. And in Dungeons and Dragons, it's similar in the sense that the DM has structures, right? But the players can make decisions infinitely. In this game, they need to make it feel infinite,
Right.
but it literally cannot be infinite.
Well, and in
Exactly.
D&D, the DM can plan an account. If you walk into a room, he can say, it's a room, it's got a fireplace and a bed. And the player asks, does that bed have feet? It is at that moment that the DM decides yes or no it has feet, and they may not have thought about that beforehand. A game doesn't have that luxury.
They have to think about that beforehand.
They have to think about that beforehand.
It's Schrodinger's bed. You
Schrodinger's
can't-
bed.
yeah,
but
you can't-
D&D exists in that post-structural Schrodinger's
Yeah,
bed realm.
yeah, exactly. Schrodinger's bed realm.
So we're transmediating Schrodinger's
Yeah.
existence,
Well,
right?
I mean, this is
It's wild.
quantum ogres, right? You've heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the thing about D&D is, in theory, you've got infinite choice, but
Yeah.
realistically,
Well, it's like real life, like the
Yeah.
physical world, right? I have theoretically, I could try to like break down that door. I could make that choice. Am I going to?
Yeah.
No. Can I
Well-
break down that door? Still probably not. I don't think my strength is big enough for that role. You know.
No.
Yeah, well, what I was getting at is it's called quantum ogres. I can't remember who named it that, but it's this idea in D&D that sometimes the choices are in fact false choices.
Yeah.
Because if the DM plans for you to go into the castle where there are some ogres and you'll find the ogres, and then you decide, nah, screw that, we're gonna go explore the swamp. Well, now there's some ogres in the swamp.
Yeah.
Right? Now, it's not always like that, and I will say, I do tell my players, like, look, if you get bored of the story we're working on right now, you can pick a random direction and just walk 1,000 miles.
Right.
It's like, that's fine.
I think,
I'll
and
roll with it.
that's interesting because video games always have false choices, so to speak. So
Yeah.
like, whenever a game asks you for your name and there's no consequence to putting a name down, that's like a false choice, right? It's not actually changing anything. But it's different from D&D where like a false choice is the sense of like, I pick not to see the ogres in the castle, boom, they're in the swamp now.
Right.
Whereas you're going to act like, oh, they were always in the swamp. You just didn't know, right? So I think it's interesting to think of. It's a different kind of transmediation where you're transmediating something that exists in the form of rules,
Yes.
but not as the actual story of the media part of it
Right.
is an ephemerality.
There's no
right? It
there's no
exists in
media to
limbo. There's no media to
transmediate.
transmediate. Yeah. So interesting stuff there. Actually, wow, what a pixel.
What a pixel.
So getting into some more stuff here, I think is a situation where some things that are transmediated from D&D to Baldur's Gate 3 and other games as well, but that maybe shouldn't be. So the barrier to entry, right? Because I know in D&D it's pretty high. It's part of why I never got into it. And we can talk about that a little bit. But this happens in Baldur's Gate as well, which I was going to say Baldur's Gate 2, but I mean Baldur's Gate 3 too.
Yeah,
As well.
Yeah,
Also.
as well.
Also in Baldur's Gate.
Yes. So the character creation, like the sheer amount of stuff that you can pick in character creation in Baldur's Gate 3, like I said, it took me 3 hours, right? So let's talk about this in D&D a little bit, and then I'm going to get into the pixels I wanted to get into here. So so tell me a little bit about character creation in D&D.
It's actually limited compared to what you have in D&D.
Yeah, D&D is harder.
So here they only give you basically the choices or options from 2 of the textbooks, the Player's Handbook and I think Xanathar's Guide
I think so.
to everything. In D&D there are currently, in 5th edition, there are currently like 25 books, and 6 of those are character creation options. So like one of the classes that I've always wanted to play is a hunter that is a swarm keeper, that doesn't just keep one animal but keeps like swarms of bees, and they didn't have that as an option, so I couldn't go with it. Or my favorite class that I play whenever I play one-shots is a College of Eloquence bard. which is a bard that's like a rhetorician, right? That
Wow,
can
shocker.
speak really, I know,
Right.
Yeah.
clearly. And so they didn't have that, and so it is limited. And then in D&D, you can even make deals or bargains with your DM. So you can say, hey, I know that I'm playing a warrior, and warriors generally can use a sword or a greatsword, but I want to be like an anime character, and I want to carry a giant buster blade.
Yeah.
Can I do that? And the DM can be like, yeah, sure. So it gets worse, is the only thing I'll say. When you hit a
oh,
real-
yeah.
Well,
But
the D&D one is worse.
is worse.
Yeah, the barrier to entry in D&D is higher.
It is literally sit down and read some textbooks, or generally you start new players off by like creating their characters
Yeah.
for them.
Yeah, like I walk my players through the process of
Yeah.
making their characters, and that-
Literally, you guys walk and talk and stuff.
No, we I rented it. I like
Go line by line on the
I not
characters.
rented. I reserved a room in our like office building at the University of Kentucky.
That's awesome.
And then like walked the new players through. It was like, okay, so everyone does their class. Okay, so now we're gonna roll our hit points. Now we're gonna fill out our stats.
It's interesting because the game has to do that, and they can't do it by talking to you.
Exactly.
So the UI just has to tell you how to do it.
Yeah.
Which in the UI has a lot of stuff.
Has a
Yeah.
lot of stuff, but it is, for the amount of stuff, I will say I think it's pretty clean.
It's pretty intuitive. Yeah, like making my character here was
I
probably
won't say intuitive.
pretty intuitive if you know D&D well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to
So
say.
it was pretty intuitive.
Yeah.
Like for me, I was like, oh, okay, and so I was able to fill out my character like much more quickly than even like usually I would with a D&D
Yeah.
character. Mostly because I've been going through all these books and like trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to do, and then here it was it was a much more efficient.
So it's
But-
interesting because to me,
Yeah, how did
the
it feel?
UI does not feel clean or intuitive or streamlined, but I can see where you guys are coming from. Because like when I play FIFA, I'm like, this makes so much sense. But when people that don't play soccer games go into FIFA, they're like, what are these dots on this board? What is happening here?
Because they don't
Right?
know the strategies
Exactly.
or plays. Or,
Exactly.
Yep.
So it makes sense to hear you say, and I'm glad to hear that because it means that they did a good job. But to me, I was like, what?
Yeah.
So I wrote a thing that interesting here. So we talked about demand earlier, which is the concept by Dr. Nick Bowman, it's how much a game requires of you, the player, in order to engage with it, right? Because movies don't do that. You can put a movie and like not watch it. The movie's going to keep playing.
Right.
You can put a game in the background, not pick up the controller, and likely you're going to like die or nothing's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
So it requires you to do certain things. What this game does is it has pre-game demand, where it requires a lot of you cognitively and like emotionally to decide what you're going to be for the rest of the time in the first 2 hours without knowing a lot, in my case.
Yep.
Right? So it's just an interesting thinking exercise of how much can a game demand of you before you even start the game.
Yeah.
Right? And that's the barrier to entry thing.
And I think it's really interesting to hear your feelings on that, because I want to know, both right now, how that felt when you had to go through all that.
Yes.
And I want to know, at the end of like, or 2 weeks, your first impressions, I want to know how it felt having a character that was that what you wanted to play.
Yeah.
Right?
And part of it why it took so long too is because I'm trying to make a character based on a character that is in Japanese. And while I know a little Japanese, I have to like, move around and also into a game that I've never played. So I did some stuff on my own. Eventually I found someone on YouTube who makes builds of characters from anime into D&D.
Into 5e.
And into 5e, and I took some stuff because not all of it translated.
Right.
But it worked, but that took a while as well. Knowing how to play video games helps me because I can navigate the menus, but
Right.
not knowing some of the stuff does not help me.
All
Right.
that.
And I think some of the things, but I'm sure it helps you, right? So
Yep.
it's kind of like, as a developer, you're like, where's the line? How can we...
Who are we designing
Yeah.
for?
How can we make this easier for players that know D&D, but also not daunting for those that don't,
Right.
right? And I think they towed that line pretty well. It's just it is a complex process, and like you said,
It is.
they made it less complex.
You'll have to let me know, because when they popped up the little like, would you like a tutorial window? I was like, no.
I clicked that.
And so I want to know how you feel the tutorial feels.
Well, they basically explain like in the character creation, they just like explain like this is where you pick this is where you pick this. It's not a lot.
It's not in depth.
It's
Okay.
not a lot.
That's what I was wondering.
So in the character creation, there is a lot of options. This is something we're going to discuss here a little bit, but there's like 4 things that I was like, I don't understand how these are really different.
Yeah.
Right. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So you can pick your origin, your background, your race, and your class. And I kind of want to go through these, and you both can answer right different. So first of all, what is class?
Class is the most important decision you're going to make in D&D. It comes sort of first to everything else, and that is your job. But in video game terms, it works the same as it does in like World of Warcraft. That is the thing that the way you are going to fight and do things in the world.
Yeah, and it works. I mean, it works more like Overwatch, right?
Overwatch.
Anything, or even like Battlefront.
Right.
Like you're picking like I'm a sniper, I'm whatever, right?
So
I'm
the other choices are
infantry,
all
stuff like that.
secondary. If you want to like fight big things and swing a sword, barbarian fighter. If you want to do magic, wizard. If you want to do magic but not think that hard about it, sorcerer, right?
I don't know. That's sure.
Yeah,
Brandon made a face.
Funny joke for the wizards out there.
For the Wizards of not the coast.
I
So
will out DPS you every day.
background. What is background? Brandon, you take this one.
That is what your character did before they became an adventurer. So did they grow up on the streets pickpocketing for a living? Urchin. Were they a career soldier before that? Soldier. There are obviously a whole lot of these, but basically it's where your character comes from. It's their history.
So what is then origin?
Origin is only used in Baldur's Gate 3. That's not an
Yes.
actual 5e
Because I think what you just described as background was actually origin
Origin
in
is,
Baldur's Gate.
Origin is
in
more
Baldur's
like the character, isn't it? I'm trying to remember exactly where they use that.
Yeah. So as you can see, dear listeners, it gets very confusing. And it does affect your stats like minimally. These two,
Yep.
right? Not minimally. Like they're pretty big, but like they're not like something that's gonna make or break certain things. So background and origin are, you know, one of the two is like the thing you did before this, and one of the two is where you're literally from, like because there's different parts.
Be
that you
from
can
Baldur's Gate.
Yeah.
I mean, and it does give you dialogue options based on that. So
Yeah.
every now and then, because I said I was from Baldur's Gate and I said I was from a university, it'll give me options where
Yes.
it's like Baldur's Gate. Yeah, I know
Yeah, I've
that
been there,
wine
yeah.
cellar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have class, which is your job, and then we have race, which from what I understand is an issue in D&D, not necessarily only in BG3. And we're gonna get into this because when I was picking these, I got a little confused. But the best way to think about this or race, and it made a lot more sense when I thought about it this way, and John told me this, and then Brendan did as well, is that it's more like species.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right. So when they put
Absolutely.
race on there,
It's been misnamed.
it's been misnamed, and that's the issue. And I think a lot of and I read a couple articles about this before. Some of them on like gaming websites, like Gizmodo and Gamasutra, and some of them on like actual art, like peer-reviewed articles, right? But it appears the issue is that it is misnamed is the biggest thing. There's some other stuff, right? But the fact that it's called race, and then you associate a lot of attributes to that, makes it a complex scenario.
Because in D&D, a black human and a white human are both considered a racial human.
Yes.
Like that is they don't separate out between those two.
Yes.
The differences in race are the differences between humans, bird people, alligators, dragons.
Yeah.
That is racial differences.
And
so it's been misnamed in D&D, and that is a problem. People have written about it.
And it's not a problem in Baldur Gate 3 or only in D&D, or it's you know, in society.
Well, really, it draws from Tolkien's mythology, and that's why the race of men, the race of elves, the race of dwarves,
Yes.
and that's why we have continued to. Whether we should or not is another discussion.
Right.
But it historically comes from Tolkien.
Yeah, and I think some of the discussion as well, and I did read about that, and I know that it's like a 50 or 60 year problem in game, and a much larger problem in the physical world, or things we have to work on. But part of the issue whenever someone like a game I read about this, games that are replaced race with species, they still use some sort of like racially coded language, like orcs are bloodthirsty, right? Which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Actually, right now. So I think a lot of the discussion here is about it's nurture of that species rather than race, right? So if you think about species, it's more like a tiger will be faster than a giraffe, but a giraffe will be taller than a tiger.
Yeah.
Right.
That's kind of the best way to think about it.
Right.
Right. They're not different races or different species.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And the problem where it gets real problematic when we talk about it is with things that are internalized, right? So we have like intelligence, and dragons are innately in the D&D universe far more intelligent. They're like born being able to do pre-calculus, right? And so it affects the way that dragons act around other things, and that complicates it when we start to treat humanoids as different races.
Yeah, and I think the best way to think about it is the nature versus nurture aspect, and I'm going to pass it on to Brandon because he explained this to me in the way that yesterday that I was like, this clicked with me better than anything else.
Yeah, so thinking about like orcs, right? So when you pick an orc in D&D, you know, you pick that as your race, really your species, you get like a bonus to your strength, right? So orcs are naturally large and strong. like people from Northern Europe are naturally larger.
Vikings.
Yeah, Vikings, right? And so it makes sense that there are these different bonuses, right? I will say, like, from a gameplay perspective, it makes a lot of sense because you want playing an orc to feel different from playing a halfling. Where we run into problematics, though, and I think John might actually be able to do better than this, is with the history of how we got to assigning these bonuses,
Right.
and especially when we start assigning negative inherent traits. Do you
Yeah,
wanna-
so the issue is that Tolkien based a lot of his works off of conflicts that actually happened in real life between people. Conflicts between the Romans and the Mongols, conflicts between sort of like the Chinese armies and the Northern Plains tribes that were happening. Because of that, he associated certain characteristics, these barbarian characteristics, with physical characteristics that may have existed in those people. And so we have this terrible situation where if this was all in a vacuum and we wanted to have different races, it would be great, and we'd have orcs and humans and elves and there'd be no issue. But because these have all been racially coded onto similar actual people, right? The elves are actually like Norwegian individuals. We are associating these traits, positive and negative, with this. So if we say elves are smarter, are we subconsciously coding that like Norwegians are smarter, and what kind of statements does that make?
Right.
Or the Finnish are smarter? And so that's a problem, and I think it's a problem that we need to be aware of, while still admitting that if we had a whole game that was all humans, and all the humans had the exact same traits, and we could just like dye them different colors,
or make them like slightly taller or slightly shorter without
Anything
actually having
changing.
any effect.
it would make for a more boring game from a gameplay
So what you have to
perspective.
think about here too is that in this game and in D&D, if you are shorter versus taller, it makes a difference in the way that other games maybe don't. So like, let's say if Persona 4 had like you can be 5'10" or 6'6", that would change nothing.
Right.
You play the same.
Exactly.
In this game, if you're 5 foot versus 6'6", the 5 foot person will likely be much better at sneaking,
And stealth.
while the 6'6" person will likely be much better at like looking further out.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Because those are things that matter in this game.
Right.
Right.
Right, and then like in 5th edition, gnomes and dwarves, because they're shorter, are slower moving. They only move 25 feet around instead of
30.
30
Right.
like an elf or
Right.
a human.
Literally longer legs, right? Like
Yeah.
a giraffe can reach higher things than a tiger can because of its neck.
They try to get like the pros and cons that would actually come from being that size,
Right.
right? So, you know, my friend John here can reach things that I absolutely cannot. I need less food to survive than he needs.
Yes, trade-off.
Right, so there's
Trade-offs.
a
Trade-offs.
trade-off there. Actually, you know, the actor Warwick Davis actually talked about this.
Yeah.
He did an AMA on Reddit, and someone asked him, you know, what are the benefits to being your height? He said, no one ever asked me that, but I was the chin-up champion at my high school because I have good upper body
Pull
strength
anything with
Yeah.
you.
and very low weight. And so, yes, there are benefits
cool.
to different body types, and I think that
And Warwick Davis is awesome.
exactly. Oh, he's a fantastic
Yeah,
actor. He's
yeah.
hilarious. And I think it's also important to explore the rich variety that comes from everything that humanity and humanoids have to offer, and that there are benefits to being like a slender, like 4'10" person that maybe aren't always super apparent.
But this game makes them.
Same with like
Yeah,
if
exactly.
you can't, but like if you pick to be like a spider, that there are benefits to being like you can climb on walls and stuff.
And I
right?
think
Exactly.
there are even narrative benefits. So I was talking about this the other day, but I think one of the things that D&D has that our real world doesn't that's kind of interesting is because you have creatures like dragons that can outthink you any day of the week and twice on Sunday, humans don't get to be the smartest thing on the planet, and you really get to think about how that changes the world and the story,
dynamics, yeah.
the dynamics when it's
Yeah.
not just like, oh, he's like a Moriarty character that's on the same level as Sherlock, but they have to play this game together. What if you have a Moriarty that Sherlock really does seem cognitively deficient in comparison to?
Yeah.
It makes a more engaging story because you have a predator that can outdo everything you do. They're stronger, they're faster, and it makes them terrifying.
Right, for sure.
Right. And
Um,
it raises the question too of then like the world building gets a lot richer because you have to think about why aren't the dragons in charge?
Yeah, what is
Yeah.
the worth of humans, and why are humans still like
Yeah.
so prevalent?
Yeah.
And
Like,
what is the strength of the humanoid? And so there's a lot of deep
A
questions.
lot
That's
of
what I'm
deep
getting
questions,
at.
but what I wanted to get to is that something Brendan wrote here, and we didn't get to, but basically, I'm just going to read this because he said there's two things he's trying to get at: natural variations in racial groups where species exist, which we talked about. Like John is taller than Brandon,
Right.
giraffes are taller than tigers, etc. But some of these are subject to culture, right?
Oh, yeah. So,
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, no good.
So one of the points that I made is like culture really can affect genetic variations.
Yeah, so you have the example of, Brazilian culture is stereotypically, but true, very geared towards soccer.
Right.
So there's one of the reasons we have a lot of good Brazilian soccer players is because not only because of the way the genetics worked and the mixture of different Europeans with local tribes and that kind of stuff and the body types, but also because people play soccer all the time. Like we grow up playing soccer. I remember I would play soccer in my school. I would go play soccer with my friends. Soccer's on TV. So there are soccer movies. The most famous people in the country are soccer players. The higher salaries in the country are soccer players. So it is a culture built around soccer, which means that everyone plays it. We find more people that are good at it, and more people become better at it because we play it all the time, right? And Brandon, you talk about here. So if orcs are described as savage, that should be because of orcish culture being savage, not because orcs themselves are, right?
Exactly.
So not every Brazilian born is going to be good at soccer, but if they interact with it enough, they might.
So we could solve some of the problematic nature of this issue by having a culture category, of having a cultural distinction between what is happening and there now.
Yeah, I think culture would be like a good, like a different option. One more option.
One more option to have.
Put one more option.
6th edition.
But I just to end here, I think Brandon's a good example of Mongol and Viking cultures were violent. It doesn't mean that all Mongolians and all Scandinavians are inherently violent. Right? It's the way the culture shapes in that period of time or era.
And it gets real dangerous the more you conflate them.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
And
That's
these
the
things
problem.
change over time.
That's a problem. So species good makes sense. The thing that Brandon said here that I thought was good is that conflating the negative traits of a culture with a species is where the problem is.
This is the problem.
Yeah.
Right? So with all that in mind, it's not that Baldur's Gate does this and D&D doesn't. This is where there's some transmediation here. It could have been done a little better. That's the argument I've seen online. But again, it's not a Baldur's Gate problem.
I think Baldur's Gate would have run into a lot of flashback if they had changed those kind of things without D&D changing them first. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing. I'm just saying that Baldur's Gate promised to be a D&D transmediation, and that would have felt like some sort of, from a certain members of the community, it probably would have.
Yeah, so perhaps it's like a tactical decision. Right?
Yeah.
Like we know this isn't the best, but it would be worse in a certain sense if we changed it.
Right.
Yeah, I kind of got that impression while I was playing the game. Like I thought maybe that's why they didn't touch that.
Yeah, cool. Okay, so I kind of wanted to ask how we are going to play this game, and I already talked about my character is based on Kazuma Sato from Konosuba. He is like a lovable rogue, I guess is the best way I can put it. But so his best stats are like not intelligence, although he is smarter than people there, but he's more of like a stealthy magic user.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna go with that.
That'd be fun.
And for like physically how I'm gonna play this game, so I'm gonna try playing it anyway, all the ways. I'm gonna try playing with my handheld on the Steam Deck.
Oh, that'd be cool.
I'm gonna try to play it with the mouse and with the controller with the Steam Deck on the TV, so a PS5 controller. And I'm also going to try to play with the mouse and keyboard, which I know that this seems like irrelevant information, but it is extremely relevant because we have a lot of research showing that not being familiar with a gaming controller changes like everything about how you play the game, right? How you feel about playing the game itself. Yeah. Not having the controller you want changes that. It's the reason people go to Street Fighter tournaments with their own little gamepad. Right? Because you're used to using that and there's not going to be any input lag, all that kind of stuff. It's the reason when I was growing up, there used to be, whenever there was a FIFA tournament, there was an Xbox bracket and a PS5 or PS bracket, and then at the end, you would play each other on each other's systems.
Wow.
Right?
That makes sense.
So that's why I'm going to do this. I want to see how it affects my immersion because I can play handheld, even though I don't play D&D. I can play with a controller, but I don't really play with a mouse and keyboard, which I think is the best way to play. Yeah. Right? So Brandon, I see that you're angry at me for asking this question. Why are you angry at me for asking how you're going to play this game?
Oh, because I started playing the game with my controller. Obviously, we talked about that back in the Portal episodes, and then my controller broke. And then the Amazon delivery was late, so I do have my new controller now, but in the meantime, I had to play 2 sessions with mouse and keyboard and got motion sickness at one point.
See, it changed completely how you play the game. The
Changed
game is the
completely how I
exact
played
same.
the game, and it was incredibly frustrating because I accidentally cast Ray of Frost on a few ceilings. Yep.
What is your character?
Oh, I am playing a draconic sorcerer with a white dragon ancestry, so I specialize in like cold spells.
Nice.
Very cool. Very
John,
cool.
what do you got?
Yeah, I'm playing as myself because the first time I threw an RPG, I always play as myself.
So just a
make the choices I'm gonna make.
Professor,
right?
Yeah.
So I have a university background
Yeah.
from Baldur's Gate, and they didn't have Eloquence Bard, which would be like the classic rhetorician or rhetor build. So I went with a wizard with an enchantment focused. So I can persuade people to do anything I want, basically. I've got maxed out charisma, maxed out intelligence, and I can charm them and enchant them so that I almost...
If that roll somehow doesn't go your way, you can still charm them.
I can charm them, and even that charm ability also gives me advantage, so it lets me roll 2 dice and take the higher of the 2. So I roll 2 dice, take the higher of the 2, and then add like 8 to that score.
Nice.
And the chances of me failing a persuasion, and then I have like initiative. I have inspiration on top of that, which lets you re-roll if you get a bad roll that you don't like. And yeah, I can persuade anybody of anything. And I actually, the greatest moment of this is there was a scene, to give you a little spoilers. There's a scene where you encounter a devil, and this devil is going to kill you because he wants to get out of his contract, and he thinks killing you will let him out of his contract. And free him, and I convinced him to instead kill himself. Skipped the whole fight. I was like, yeah, but what if you're the source of your contract? What if you have to?
Have you thought about it philosophically?
Philosophically,
Yeah.
and it was one of the best moments in the game for me, which is fun. But then I also play...
But is death the ultimate freedom, essentially what you're saying to him? Yeah.
But then because I'm also me, and I teach a little bit of ethics, and I really like that kind of stuff, I try to play very good, so I'm a strange, like, wizard, but with the attitude of like a paladin or trying to do well in the world. And it's made for a fun time, but I've had to do some things that were not as profitable. When people are like, it's our last bit of money for saving us, here you go, I'm like, don't, it's fine. Even though I really need the money. I was like, the refugees, I can't take that from them.
Of course, I've
nice.
got a bit of an issue here in that I'm playing with a friend who, I love him. I might charitably describe him, however, as chaotic. Because he refers to the NPCs as walking experience containers.
Wow.
And so it's always a discussion between him and I of like, all right, so we're going to kill all of these villagers, right? And I'm like, well, maybe not.
It'd be interesting though, because I want to see where that campaign takes you, because mine is taking me in very clear directions. Like, you have the ability to get bonus stuff from like taking these worms and putting them in your eyeballs. And I was like,
what?
No. So I've played the whole game not getting any extra bonus powers from doing this. And it's made the game much harder. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I used them once, and then the Gith was like, that's probably a bad idea. And I'm like, yeah, you're probably right.
No, I think that it's interesting, because from what I've heard and read in like reviews, it's people talk about this is where it gets really close to D&D when you play with someone else.
Yeah.
Because then you have 3 or 4 people on screen, 2, 3, 4 people on screen doing random chaotic stuff, so that I think I was like reading, talking about like they were stuck in a room and they had to get out, and they were like discussing what they're gonna do, and one of the characters just pulled a lever and it released grease into the room, and a fireball came in and killed them all. So one action from one person killed everyone in the room, right?
D&D.
Which is D&D, exactly.
Yeah, we have had those issues happen.
But yeah, so with that in mind, just D&D simulator. We're closing the first episode here on Baldur's Gate 3. So in 3 weeks, we will be back with our first impressions on the game. I know John's already like 30 hours in, so he has first impressions, but he's going to withhold them until then.
True.
And I think we should be at the end. We should have finished Act 1.
I think that's reasonable.
I think I'm probably not too far off.
Yeah, which is supposed to be like 20 to 25 hours.
The Goblin Camp. We beat the Goblin Camp.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, is that the end of Act 1?
That's the end of Act 1.
Oh, okay. Well, yes, then maybe, close to Act 3.
You can get part of the way through Act 2, I think.
Okay, cool. Well, we will be past the Goblin Camp.
Yes.
In 3 weeks.
Sounds good.
Sounds doable.
But yeah, thanks again for joining us here at Professor's Play, the show in which you can get to the pixel of deep thinking with your video game discussions. I'm Professor Phil Chavot. He's Professor Brendan West. He's Professor John Adams. And together we are professors who play video games. And we'll see y'all in 3 weeks.
Welcome back.
I hate it here.